أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وجاء إخوة يوسف فدخلوا عليه فعرفهم وهم له منكرون ولما جهزهم بجهازهم قال ائتوني بأخ لكم من أبيكم ألا ترون أني أوفي الكيل وأنا خير المنزلين فإن لم تأتوني به فلا كيل لكم عندي ولا تقربون قالوا سنراود عنه أباه وإنا لفاعلون وقال لفتيانه اجعلوا بضاعتهم في رحالهم لعلهم يعرفونها إذا انقلبوا إلى أهلهم لعلهم يرجعون. صدق الله العظيم. My dear respected brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to another weekly Seerah Halaqah, where we have discussed last week and ended off the discussion with Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam attaining the control and power over the affairs of Egypt, and where the Malik and the king not only granted him the position of the finance minister, but also gave him control over the entire affairs of the land. And this is after making Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam stay as a distinguished house in his household, in order to benefit from his presence and in order to gauge his character. So Malik Rayyan, upon seeing his nobility and his honesty and his intellectual acumen, he steps back and he hands over the reins to Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam. And thus Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran that وَكَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُفَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. In this way we established and situated Yusuf alayhi salam in the land, يَتَبَوَّأُ مِنْهَا حَيْثُ يَشَاءُ, in such a way that he had the authority to dwell and to basically settle down wherever he wished. And مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُفَ فِي الْأَرْضِ also refers to his marriage to Zulaykha, the wife of the Aziz of Misr, who previously had tried to seduce him, and for that he had to endure long years in prison. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala manifested that relationship in a very halal way. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then again said, نُصِيبُ بِرَحْمَتِنَا مَن نَشَاءُ. This was not due to the excellence of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam himself. It was not through his ability, but rather it was the rahmah and the mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that Allah decided to have the things play out the way that He had them play out. You know, that first and foremost, Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam had to go through so many trials and so many difficulties, and yet those that were the naysayers, those that constantly plotted against him, eventually they all were brought. They were disgraced and they were brought down, and their plot failed. Right. So, with regards to the plotting of Zulaykha, the plotting of the women of Egypt, the prisoner, and anyone else that tried to harm him, Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam came out on top of everything else. There remains the case of his brothers, right? The original perpetrators of the crimes against Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam. And today, in today's verses, inshallah, we will be discussing how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reverses the role on his brothers who sold him as a child into slavery, and they got rid of him in order to capture the attention of their father. And we will see that how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forced them to humble themselves and humiliate themselves and to bow down before Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, in a literal sense. But before we move on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ends off this verse by saying something very, very important, and He says, وَلَا نُضِيعُ أَجْرَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. That Allah proclaims that those people that are the righteous ones, those people that do good, those people that do right by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah will never ever let their efforts go to waste. This is the most amount, this is the ayah or the portion of the ayah that believers can draw the most amount of hope from. That no matter what, this is all going to count for something, for us to make an effort, for us to keep on trying, for us to carry on doing things even when other people have decided not to do them, for us to practice on our Islam, for us to practice on our Iman. There is still some benefit to it. It is still worth it. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is promising that reward will be there for any person who keeps up their effort. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, وَلَأَجْرُ الْآخِرَةِ خَيْرٌ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَكَانُوا يَتَّقُونَ. But obviously, no matter what type of bounty, what type of blessing you can get in the life of this world, the blessings that a person will receive in the akhirah is something that is incomparable to the blessings of this world. Because what Jannah contains, right, according to the Hadith Qudsi that is mentioned, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَعْدَدْتُ لِعِبَادِ الصَّالِحِينَ مَا لَا عَيْنٌ رَأَتْ وَلَا أُذُنٌ سَمِعَتْ وَلَا خَطَرَ عَلَى قَلْبِ بَشَرٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Hadith Qudsi that I have prepared for my righteous servants a paradise that such a paradise that no eyes have ever seen it, no ears have ever heard about it, and no human heart has ever conceptualized the reality of such a thing, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is promising such a great reward in return for a person being righteous, being a practicing believer in the life of this world. Moving on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in ayah number 58, He mentions and transitions into the mention of the brothers of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, because these people had obviously done wrong against Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam. They plotted against him, and they plotted to first and foremost kill him, and then they abandoned him, and they eventually sold him to slavery. So due to this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala presented a scenario and situation where they would in turn become humbled, and they would have to realize their shortcomings and their mistakes, and they would confess to it, right? So Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the mention of the way that the proposal had been given by Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam of how he would carry out the affairs. And accordingly, when he is established on the throne and he's given that authority, immediately he sets himself to the task, right? And he sets himself to the overseeing of the storage of the grains and making sure the produce is yielding the most amount, so because the first 7 years was going to be the 7 years of prosperity. So Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam completely oversees all of that, and he makes sure that there's no wastage. He makes sure that everything is carried out with honesty. And the beneficial part was that the people were also incentivized to grow even more, and they were incentivized by the fact that they could actually keep back 1/5 of the crops that they had grown, and the other portions would be taken by the state, and this is something that would go into the treasury itself. So this was mutually beneficial, not only just for the state and for the government itself, because the state treasuries would be filled, but secondly, it was also beneficial for the farmers themselves, because it would allow them to basically store their own crops, their own stock, and their own yield, so they would not become dependent on the government for handouts when the famine would strike. And then we see that, subhanAllah, this marvelous plan of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam actually comes into fruition, and he is able to successfully render the crops being stored and grown and stored in a correct way, and then the 7 years now arrive, the 7 years of famine. And mashallah, due to the foretelling and the actions of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, the people of Egypt are now in a very good state, in a very prosperous state, because they had planned for the famine way ahead in advance. However, this was not the case for the people in other countries. This is a famine that was very widespread, and the people from other lands and other countries, they had also been affected. And as a result of that, they were desperate. Many people were extremely hungry. They were without food. There was no rains, obviously, and due to that, there was no crops. There was nothing to eat. And Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, in order to help out the neighboring nations, he uh, basically proposed a plan that each and every person who would come to Egypt and would come to the royal court seeking grains and food for themselves, Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam would allow them to barter and to buy grain, right? But in order to keep the justice, in order to keep the system intact in such a way that some people do not take advantage over the rest of the people, the rule that he established was that each and every person that was coming from outside of Egypt and they wanted to acquire and procure grain for themselves, food for themselves, each person would only be given one camel load only. And this is due to the fact that Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam wanted to make sure that no one basically took advantage of the system. No one basically bought more than they needed, and then they would go and sell it on the black market, or they would go and then completely raise the prices and make other people suffer. Right. So this was an amazing execution and an amazing strategy that Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam came up with. And in order to not only just make sure that that the people were all dealt with fairly, Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam himself used to oversee every single transaction. Every time visitors would come from outside, traders and merchants and normal common people who would come seeking to buy grain, Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam would oversee their sale himself. So every camel load that was given, it was only given as one camel load to one person. So similarly, we find that Sayyidina Yaqub alayhi salam, the father of Yusuf alayhi salam, and his family, as they were residing in Canaan, right? Canaan in ancient Palestine. This used to be one of the cities of Palestine. Obviously, in modern day Palestine, in modern day maps, according to that, everything is obviously included in that. So Sayyidina Yaqub alayhi salam actually resided with his family in a city called Khalil, right? Khalil is a city that is the modern name for it is, or the Latinized name for it is Hebron. Hebron is a city, or is one of the largest cities in the West Bank. It's in the southern part of the West Bank, and this is also known as the resting place of the bodies of Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam and Ishaq and Yaqub, etc. So this and historians say that one of the reasons why Khalil was named Khalil, right? This was after Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, right? We know that Ibrahim alayhi salam is the patriarch of all of the major Abrahamic faiths, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And Khalil, the city itself, was named after Ibrahim alayhi salam because his nickname was Khalil. Khalil means friend, and the full name for the city was Khalilur Rahman. He was known as the friend of the most merciful, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And thus this city was named after Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam. Nevertheless, moving on, right, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the family of Sayyidina Yaqub alayhi salam, even they were affected by this famine, and eventually they ran out of food. and because they had such a large family and they had needs that were to be met, Sayyidina Yaqub alayhi salam had heard the news regarding regarding Yusuf alayhi salam in Egypt, that there's this man in Egypt who's in control of the treasuries, and he is a merciful person, and he deals with strangers, in a very just way. So Sayyidina Yaqub alayhi salam instructed his sons to take whatever they had in terms of wealth, jewelry, other goods, materials, so that these things could be exchanged in order to buy some food from there. And he also had heard that Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam only gives one camel load. So he sends all 10. He had obviously 11 sons. According to him, he had 11 sons left. So out of them, he sends 10 of his sons. He sends the 10 brothers of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, and he keeps behind with him the full brother of Yusuf alayhi salam by the name of Binyamin, right? And he's known as Benjamin, right? Benjamin in the biblical terms. And Binyamin is then kept by Yaqub alayhi salam. And the reason for this is that after losing Yusuf alayhi salam, Yaqub alayhi salam then grew very attached to Binyamin because he was the youngest out of all of them. He was also the brother of Yusuf alayhi salam. And he kept him back because, again, Binyamin's presence would bring comfort to him. He loved him very much. And thirdly, on top of that, he was afraid that his half brothers, the 10 brothers, would again plot against him. So he sends the 10 sons. And this is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala now talks about, and he says that وَجَاءَ إِخْوَةُ يُوسُفَ فَدَخَلُوا عَلَيْهِ فَعَرَفَهُمْ وَهُمْ لَهُ مُنْكِرُونَ. And Yusuf alayhi salam's brothers, they came to Egypt and they presented themselves before him. And what happened is فَعَرَفَهُمْ وَهُمْ لَهُ مُنْكِرُونَ, that he recognized them, but they did not recognize him. And why was this? This was due to the fact that when they had sold Yusuf alayhi salam into slavery, he was a child of 7 years. And some scholars and ulama, they mentioned that 40 years had already passed. 40 years had transpired and passed, or rather that, yes, I'm sorry, 40 years had passed since that time. And obviously, Yusuf alayhi salam in this time had transitioned. He had grown up. His features and his looks had completely changed. He was also dressed in a different way. He was dressed in the royal garments and robes and other things like that. So they did not recognize Yusuf alayhi salam, right? Because it wasn't, even in their, wildest dreams could they even think and imagine that Yusuf alayhi salam, the same child that we first threw into the well and then we sold him into slavery, that this child would then go on to become the minister of a country. All right, they couldn't fathom that, like, let alone becoming the minister, that this person would become the regent and then eventually the king. This is something that they had never ever thought could ever happen. But again, look at the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They had chosen to disgrace Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam. They had chosen to suppress him and to commit evil against him. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala eventually causes Yusuf alayhi salam to come out on top of them. He grants him victory. He grants him triumph. And in this case, we see that the brothers are completely humbled before him. Right? They present themselves in the court in front of him in a very, very humbled way, and they are desperate, and their situation is one of, desperation. وَهُمْ لَهُ مُنْكِرُونَ. Normally, the word inkar means to make something a stranger, right? In this context, the word munkirun here refers to the fact that they did not recognize him, that they did not. They completely didn't understand and recognize that this was the same brother that they had committed such atrocities against. Anyways, when Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, when they had approached, the Quran does not make mention of this. But according to Ibn Kathir rahimahullah, when the brothers of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam came into the royal court, Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam began to interrogate them. And he interrogated them in such a way as a person would to suspicious people. So the first question he said that is that who are you people? You're not residents of Egypt, and you speak Hebrew. Where are you coming from? So he basically questioned them in multiple different ways. And then the brothers, they answered and they said that, look, we've come here to purchase grain. We've come here to get some food. We've heard that you're a very just person, and you are willing to help people out in this time of great difficulty. So we've come to barter and trade with you in order to provide food for our families, and this is our desperate situation. So Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam responded and he said that, how do I know that you're not an enemy spy? That you've come from a different land and you've come to spy on us in order to take that knowledge back to your country. So they answered that this can never be. We are actually from the family of the Prophet of Allah, Yaqub alayhi salam. We're from his household, and it is not becoming of us that we would lie, and we would that we would spy in this way. So Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, ulama and scholars, they mentioned that the reason why he was questioning them in this way is that he knew their nature. He knew that they had the habit of lying, and he wanted them to clarify the entire situation for him. So eventually, when he questions them, the question then moves to the family, right? So he asked them that, how many brothers do you have? So they said that we were total of 12 brothers, but then one of our brothers got lost in the forest. And we have another brother who is the youngest of us, and he is with his father, and his father has kept him behind because he is a source of comfort for him, and he's also the youngest, and so he's very attached to him, and this is why he's not here. So Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam wanted to find out about the condition of his brother Binyamin, and in order to incentivize them, in order to make sure that he would get to meet Sayyidina Binyamin, he not only accepted their answers, but he also treated them very, very in a very good way. What he did is that after their questioning, he had them actually put up in the royal court. He had them actually put up in the royal household, and they were housed as distinguished guests, and they were treated very well and with royalty and things like that. And after that, as they were about to depart, we see that in the next ayah, in ayah number 59, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَمَّا جَهَّزَهُمْ بِجَهَازِهِمْ قَالَ أَتُونِي بِأَخٍ لَكُمْ مِنْ أَبِيكُمْ. As they're about to leave, and he completely, was very generous. He gave them each a camel load, and they were laden, and they were happy. They were about to depart. He then makes his request, and he says, "I'tuni bi akhil lakum min abikum." You know that brother that you mentioned? Next time that you approach, make sure that you bring him with you. And in order to incentivize them, he says, "Ala tarawna anni ufil kayla wa ana khairul munzilin." Do you not see that I, provide the full measure, that I don't skimp on giving, food, because he had given each and every one of them their entire camel load, right? And he hadn't skimped on any of the measures itself. أَلَا تَرَوْنَ أَنِّي أُوفِي الْكَيْلَ. Do you not see that I give the full measure, and that I also am a very hospitable host? وَأَنَا خَيْرُ الْمُنزِلِينَ. Right? That not only will, the next time you arrive, if you bring your brother with you, you will also receive an extra camel load, and you will also be treated and hosted in a very nice way. And then in order to further, kind of motivate them to bring Binyamin with them the next time, he said to them, فَإِن لَمْ تَأْتُونِي بِهِ فَلَا كَيْلَ لَكُمْ عِنْدِي وَلَا تَقْرَبُونَ. Right? If you don't bring your brother the next time you come, then don't expect to receive anything from me, and don't even bother coming. Don't even bother to receive the same type of treatment that you had experienced on this journey. Right? So make sure that you bring him, otherwise I'm not dealing with you any further. And so when the brothers of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam heard this, they they assured him, and they said that سَنُرَاوِدُ عَنْهُ أَبَاهُ وَإِنَّا لَفَاعِلُونَ, that we will surely try to prevail over our father. We will convince him no matter what. We'll make sure that he sends him. We'll make sure that we convince him by hook or crook, and we will bring him with us. We know that you're a generous host. We know that you're a truthful man, and we will bring him. So don't make liars out of us. We will definitely bring him the next time we come and visit you, and the next time we come back. So Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, the reason why he does this is that, number one, obviously he wanted to make sure that his brother Binyamin was brought, so that he could see him, because it had been such a long time since he had seen his full brother. And also at the same time, he wanted to test his brothers to see if they would be honest, and to make them go through this other trial, right? Because they also deserve to suffer in this way, because of the way that they had treated Yusuf alayhi salam to begin with. And then as they were leaving, وقال لفتيانه جعلوا بضاعتهم في رحالهم لعلهم يعرفونها إذا انقلبوا إلى أهلهم لعلهم يرجعون. He told his servants. He told his servants, as they were packing the grains onto the animals, that اجعلوا بضاعتهم في رحالهم, that put all of their goods, that they had brought to trade with, right? All of the jewelry, all of the cash, any of the other items that they brought to barter with, put all of those things secretly back into their packs, right? Put it back into their camel loads, but put it in such a way that they will not discover them until and unless they reach home, right? لعلهم يعرفونها إذا انقلبوا إلى أهلهم. And when they reach their families and they open up their packs, then they will find these things, and they will understand that the generosity that is present here in this court. لعلهم يرجعون, and this will prompt them to come back again, to come back to the royal court of Egypt. Ibn Kathir rahimahullah, he actually mentions that there are three reasonings of why Yusuf alayhi salam had this done. Number one was that, subhanallah, Yusuf alayhi salam, although he was in such a high position, again, he was the prophet of Allah, and at the end of the day, no matter what they had done to him, they were still family, right? So Yusuf alayhi salam knew that the goods that they had come with, this was the only goods that they had to trade, right? This was the only thing. And therefore, for the next time, they would not have anything left to trade. And this is why Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, he returned, all of their goods back, because, he couldn't, take it upon himself to basically take away everything that they had. So that's one of the reasonings. The second reasoning that Sayyidina Ibn Kathir rahimahullah gives is that the reason why he returned back their goods is that he did not want to take any money for food, right? This is something that was very disgraceful to him, that he would take money from his family for the basic necessities of life, especially in a time of suffering and famine. So what he did is that he had all of their goods returned, and whatever the price of their goods were, he paid it out of his own pocket, and he had a deposit in the royal treasury. And the third reasoning that Ibn Kathir rahimahullah he gives, he says that the reason why Yusuf alayhi salam had his servants do this, that they would return back the goods, is that he knew the character of his father, that being a prophet of Allah, when his sons would reach home and they would open up their packs and they would find that all of those things that they had bartered with had been returned back to them, or had returned back with their goods, he, as a prophet of Allah, Yaqub alayhi salam, would then consider this to be an amana. He would consider this to be the property of the royal Egyptian treasury. And thus he would ensure that he would have those goods returned back, and this would happen in the form of him sending his sons back. So then Again, this plays into the plan of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam being able to see his brothers again, being able to deal with them again. So, inshallah, we will end off over here for tonight's halaqah. But before we go, there's one thing that might have, a question that kind of uh, jumps into the back of the mind, that how is it possible that Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, right, being a prophet of Allah, being as a noble person, being so compassionate, being so empathetic, how is it possible that Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam did not send word of his survival, of his thriving, of his condition to his beloved father Yaqub alayhi salam? I mean, imagine 40 years have now passed, right? And Yusuf alayhi salam obviously knew, obviously experienced the love that Yaqub alayhi salam had for him, right? As a child, he wouldn't even let him go too far. He would take care of every need of his. He would, grant every request. How is it possible that Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam could tolerate the grief and the sadness of his father and not send even a word? A person could say that, okay, when he was first sold into slavery, he was a child. Maybe he didn't have a way to send a word to his father. But we see that Yusuf alayhi salam then grew up in the household. He had ample opportunity to send, a word to his father or to even visit him, and he did not do so. And then we see that even in prison, most of the times it's possible to get the word out. Somebody who's stuck in prison can get the word out, and he could have sent word to his father and to his family, and again he does not do so. And then subhanallah, he ascends the throne, and he comes into power, and he's the most supreme leader in the land. And even at this time, neither does he take a trip to Canaan to visit his father, nor does he even send a messenger to his father, just to tell him that he is alive. So why is it that Yusuf alayhi salam acted in this way? So ulama and scholars, they mention that one of the reasonings, this is again from the hikmah and the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses to deal, in his creation as he wills. But they say that one of the reasonings for this was that this was a great trial for Sayyidina Yaqub alayhi salam himself. Again, we know that the prophets of Allah are very valued, and they're very they're the most devoted servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're from amongst the muqarrabeen, the closest servants of Allah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects the conduct that comes from them to be of the highest level. Right, so Sayyidina Yaqub alayhi salam manifesting his love and being so attached to Yusuf alayhi salam, and being so attached to any one from the creation, even if that person may be his own son and his own blood. For a prophet of Allah to display this amount of love, right, this amount of attachment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala perhaps did not deem this appropriate. And we see that how much of love Sayyidina Yaqub alayhi salam had for Yusuf alayhi salam, that eventually he cried so much over his loss that he happens to lose his eyesight. This is how much he had loved him. So this type of unhealthy love perhaps was not something that was accepted by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as a result, tested Yaqub alayhi salam by prolonging that period of grief upon him, by prolonging that test and that trial upon him. And then eventually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then makes him pass the test, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also has his eyesight restored back to him. We see that later on in the story, Yusuf alayhi salam actually sends his qamis, his shirt, and he tells his brothers, once the game is revealed, once it is revealed that that Yusuf alayhi salam is the one that is upon the throne, once that is revealed, then he tells his brothers that, take my shirt back to our beloved father and rub it on his face, and this will cause his eyesight to return. So subhanallah, so the scholars, they say that this is one of the reasonings for this, that Yusuf alayhi salam was prohibited by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He was actually prohibited by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through divine revelation that he should send word back to his father of his health and well-being, because this was directly a test that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was testing Yaqub alayhi salam through. So we see, subhanallah, so many lessons, so many things that we can derive from, the beautiful story of Yusuf alayhi salam and Yaqub alayhi salam, and the entire way that he carried out his affairs, despite, all odds being against him. How Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused him to prosper, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took him from weakness, and he ultimately gave him strength and success. And this is the same promise that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes for all of the believers that continue to keep up their faith and their practice and their tawakkul and their reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah promises each and every person prosperity in the life of this world, and most definitely prosperity in the akhirah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us both. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. Inshallah, next week we will continue with the following ayat. Jazakumullah khairan for attending. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.